Hinrich, a captured Wehrmacht sergeant from the Afrika Korps, had spent the last 18 months fighting in North Africa, where rationed fuel kept vehicles idle and electricity was hoarded like water. Now, as a prisoner of war on a westbound American freight train, he found his understanding of warfare upended. How could a nation at war light its cities as if peace still reigned? How could it expend such vast energy while fighting on multiple fronts across 2 oceans? He wasn't alone in his shock. Jammed into converted freight cars, hundreds of German prisoners pressed to any available window, their faces reflecting the same mix of awe and disbelief. These were veterans of campaigns across Europe and Africa, men who had witnessed the industrial might of the Third Reich at its peak, yet nothing in their experience had prepared them for this display of casual abundance. The America they had been taught to expect was supposed to be a nation of soft civilians, weakened by democracy and racial mixing, struggling to maintain basic infrastructure while sending troops overseas. Instead, they found themselves travelling through a landscape that seemed to pulse with unlimited energy. Power lines stretched across vast distances like metallic spider webs, carrying electricity to farms, factories, and cities, with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. As the train rolled through the night, carrying its cargo of stunned prisoners deeper into the American heartland, it carried with it the seeds of a revelation that would fundamentally alter how these men understood the war they had been fighting. The lights blazing outside their windows weren't just illumination. They were a declaration of industrial superiority so overwhelming that it would force even the most dedicated Nazi believers among them to question everything they thought they knew about their enemy's capabilities. The story of German prisoners of war encountering America's electrical grid for the first time is more than just a tale of culture shock. It's a window into one of the most decisive factors in World War II, the staggering industrial capacity that allowed the United States to fight a global war while simultaneously improving life on the home front. These German soldiers, many of whom had never seen electric lighting in rural areas of their own country, were about to discover that their opponent possessed an energy infrastructure so advanced and abundant that it challenged their most basic assumptions about warfare itself. The year 1943 marked a turning point in the global conflict. The tide was shifting against the Axis powers on multiple fronts, but the full extent of American industrial might was only beginning to reveal itself. While German cities implemented increasingly severe blackout protocols and factories operated on reduced power to conserve resources, American cities blazed with light. Baseball games continued under floodlights. Broadway theaters remained illuminated and factories hummed with round-the-clock production powered by an electrical grid that seemed to possess unlimited capacity. This wasn't merely a matter of having more power plants, though America certainly had those in abundance. It was a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached the relationship between civilian comfort and military necessity. Where Germany sacrificed civilian amenities for the war effort, America had built an economy capable of providing both without compromise. The electrical infrastructure that so amazed German prisoners represented decades of investment in a philosophy that abundance, not scarcity, was the key to national strength. The prisoners' boarding trains in ports like New York, Boston, and Norfolk came from diverse backgrounds that reflected the Wehrmacht's composition. There were farmers' sons from Bavaria who had never seen electric lighting outside of major cities, factory workers from the Ruhr Valley who understood industrial production but had never imagined it on this scale, and university students from Berlin who possessed theoretical knowledge of America but no practical experience of its reality. What united them all was their complete inability to process what they were seeing. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, a tank commander captured at Kasserine Pass, later wrote in his memoir about that first train journey across America. He described watching his fellow prisoners argue in heated whispers about whether the lights they were seeing could possibly be real. Some insisted it must be an elaborate deception designed to impress and demoralize prisoners. Others wondered if they had been transported to some special demonstration route designed to showcase American wealth. The possibility that this abundance was simply normal, Everyday America was too overwhelming for most to accept immediately. The scale of America's electrical infrastructure in 1943 was indeed staggering by any standard of comparison. The Tennessee Valley Authority alone had constructed a network of dams and power plants that generated more electricity than the entire nation of Germany. The Rural Electrification Administration had spent the previous decade bringing power to farmhouses and small towns across regions that had never known electric lighting. Private utility companies had built generating capacity that dwarfed anything in Europe, driven by a consumer economy that treated electricity not as a luxury to be rationed, but as a basic necessity to be abundantly supplied. But the numbers, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the psychological impact of witnessing this abundance firsthand. These German soldiers had spent years in a nation where every kilowatt-hour was precious, where factory shifts were scheduled around power availability, and where civilian lighting was severely restricted to conserve resources for the war effort. The idea that a nation could fight a global war while leaving its streetlights burning seemed to violate basic principles of resource management and military logic. As the trains carried their human cargo westward, the prisoners began to grasp that they weren't just seeing superior infrastructure. They were witnessing a completely different approach to warfare itself. American strategy wasn't based on the German model of mobilizing every resource for military production while accepting civilian hardship as necessary sacrifice. Instead, it was built on the premise that true strength came from the ability to simultaneously support both military operations and civilian prosperity. The industrial cities of the Midwest revealed this philosophy in action. Chicago blazed with lights from steel mills working around the clock to produce materials for Liberty ships and Sherman tanks. Detroit's automotive factories had converted to aircraft production without dimming a single street lamp in the residential neighborhoods that housed their workers. Pittsburgh's steel furnaces glowed against the night sky, while electric trolleys carried workers to and from shifts and plants that never stopped producing. Each mile of track, each illuminated city, each brightly lit factory complex delivered the same devastating message to the German prisoners. They had been fighting an opponent whose industrial capacity was so vast that it could afford to waste energy on a scale that their own nation couldn't imagine. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. These weren't just soldiers witnessing enemy infrastructure. They were believers in German superiority, confronting evidence that challenged their most fundamental assumptions. The transformation began even before the trains reached their destinations. Conversations among the prisoners shifted from discussions of military tactics and hopes for German victory to bewildered attempts to understand what they were seeing. Veterans who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia found themselves struggling to reconcile their battlefield experiences with this display of industrial abundance. How could a nation with such overwhelming resources have struggled in early battles? How could Germany have hoped to win a war against an opponent capable of such casual displays of wealth? The answer lay in understanding that American industrial might wasn't just about quantity. It was about a fundamentally different relationship between government, industry, and civilian society. While Germany had built a war economy based on centralized control and civilian sacrifice, America had created a system that harnessed free market competition and civilian prosperity to generate military strength. The lights burning in American cities weren't waste. They were evidence of an economy so productive that it could afford both guns and butter without choosing between them. As the first wave of German prisoners completed their cross-country journeys in early 1943, word of what they had seen began to spread through the prisoner network. Letters home, when they were permitted, carried coded descriptions of American abundance that shocked recipients in bomb-damaged German cities. Oral accounts passed between prisoners painted a picture of an opponent whose resources seemed limitless. Most importantly, these first-hand witnesses began to plant seeds of doubt about German propaganda that portrayed America as a weak, divided nation, barely capable of defending itself. The camps that awaited these prisoners would provide even more evidence of American abundance. Unlike the barely adequate prisoner facilities that Germany provided for captured Allied soldiers, American P camps were built to standards that often exceeded what these men had experienced in their own military service. Barracks were heated and electrically lit. Mess halls served portions that many prisoners hadn't seen since before the war began, and recreational facilities included electric lighting that allowed evening activities German soldiers could no longer take for granted in their homeland. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating evidence of American abundance came from the casual attitudes of their guards and camp administrators. American soldiers treated electric lighting, heated buildings, and abundant food not as precious resources to be carefully rationed, but as basic amenities that no civilized society should be without. The waste that German prisoners observed, lights left burning in empty rooms, food portions that exceeded military necessity, heating systems that maintained comfortable temperatures rather than mere survival levels, represented a mindset that viewed abundance rather than efficiency as the key to strength. The implications extended far beyond simple creature comforts. If America could afford to provide such conditions for enemy prisoners while simultaneously fighting a global war, what did that suggest about the resources available for actual military operations? The German prisoners found themselves forced to confront the possibility that their opponent possessed industrial capabilities so vast that the outcome of the war might already be determined by productive capacity rather than battlefield courage or tactical skill. This realization came in waves as different groups of prisoners arrived from different theatres of war throughout 1943 and 1944. Each new arrival brought fresh perspectives and additional evidence of American abundance. Pilots shot down over Germany described factory complexes they had targeted that seemed to rebuild themselves faster than bombing raids could damage them. Submarine crews captured in the Atlantic reported convoys so numerous that sinking individual ships seemed irrelevant to the overall flow of materials. Tank crews from Italy and France described encountering American equipment in quantities that suggested unlimited production capacity. The cumulative effect was a gradual but fundamental shift in how these prisoners understood the war they had been fighting. The propaganda they had been fed about American weakness and division began to seem not just wrong, but absurdly so. The evidence of their own eyes painted a picture of a nation so wealthy and productive that it could afford to fight a global war while improving living standards on the home front, a combination that German military doctrine had always taught was impossible. But the most profound revelations were yet to come. As prisoners settled into camp routines and began to interact with American civilians, guards, administrators, local workers, and townspeople, they discovered that the abundance they witnessed wasn't limited to military or industrial facilities. It extended into every aspect of American society, creating a civilian population whose standard of living during wartime exceeded what most Germans had enjoyed during peacetime. The stage was set for a confrontation between ideology and reality that would challenge every assumption these German soldiers held about their enemy, their cause, and the war itself. The lights that had first caught their attention from train windows were just the beginning of a revelation that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the conflict they had been fighting and the nation that had captured them. What they discovered next would prove even more devastating to their preconceptions about American society and the true balance of power in the global struggle that had brought them so far from home. The morning sun revealed what darkness had only hinted at during those first train journeys across America. As German prisoners settled into camps scattered across the continent, from Texas cotton fields to Minnesota wheat farms, they discovered that the abundance they had witnessed from train windows extended into every corner of American society in ways that challenged their most basic understanding of how nations functioned during wartime. Camp Aliceville in Alabama housed nearly 15,000 German prisoners by the summer of 1943, making it larger than most German towns. The camp's electric lighting system alone consumed more power in a single month than many German villages saw in an entire year. Every barracks building blazed with fluorescent lights that turned night into day, allowing prisoners to read, write letters, and pursue hobbies long after sunset. The administrative buildings operated around the clock under electric illumination, processing paperwork and managing logistics with an efficiency that impressed even the most skeptical former Wehrmacht officers. But it wasn't just the scale of electrical usage that stunned the prisoners. It was the casual attitude Americans displayed toward this abundance. Sergeant First Class Jimmy Patterson, a guard from rural Georgia who had grown up without electricity until his teens, thought nothing of leaving lights burning in empty rooms or running electric fans continuously during hot summer months. To him, electricity was simply there when you needed it, as reliable and abundant as the air he breathed. To prisoners like Heinrich Müller, who came from a Germany where every kilowatt-hour was precious and carefully rationed, this casual waste represented a mindset that bordered on the incomprehensible. The psychological impact deepened when prisoners began working outside the camps. Under the Geneva Convention, captured soldiers could be employed in non-military labor, and America desperately needed workers to replace the millions of men serving overseas. German prisoners found themselves harvesting crops under electric floodlights that extended working hours well into the night, loading trucks at railway stations where every platform blazed with illumination, and working in factories where electric power seemed so abundant that machines ran continuously, even when not immediately needed. Friedrich Steinberg, a former panzer mechanic from Munich, was assigned to work at a lumber mill in Oregon. What he discovered there shattered his remaining illusions about American weakness. The mill operated 3 shifts around the clock every day of the week, powered by electricity generated from Columbia River hydroelectric dams. The quantity of lumber produced in a single week exceeded what similar German facilities might produce in a month. And all of it was being processed under electric lighting so bright that nighttime work proceeded as efficiently as daytime operations. Even more remarkable was what Steinberg observed about the mill's relationship with electrical power. When a transformer failed during his second week of work, instead of shutting down operations to conserve electricity, the mill's management simply called the local utility company. Within 6 hours, crews had installed a replacement transformer and restored full power to the facility. The idea that a single industrial facility could command such rapid response from electrical utilities, and that spare transformers were readily available for immediate installation, represented a level of infrastructure redundancy the German industry could never have imagined. The abundance extended beyond industrial facilities into the communities surrounding prisoner camps. German prisoners on work details found themselves in small American towns where every home possessed electric lighting, refrigeration, and often multiple electrical appliances. Farmhouses in rural Kansas had electric milking machines and refrigerated storage facilities that would have been considered luxury items in urban Germany. Main Street businesses stayed open well into the evening under bright electric signs that advertised everything from Coca-Cola to Ford automobiles, with a cheerful extravagance that seemed to mock the austerity measures governing civilian life in Germany. These discoveries forced a fundamental recalculation of American industrial capacity. If small towns in agricultural states possessed electrical infrastructure superior to major German cities, what did that suggest about America's to sustain wartime production? The prisoners began to understand that they hadn't just been fighting an enemy with superior numbers. They had been fighting an opponent whose civilian economy alone possessed greater industrial capacity than Germany's entire war machine. The realization came in stages, each more devastating than the last. Prisoners working in agricultural regions discovered that American farmers used electric power for tasks that German farmers accomplished by hand or with animal labor. Electric pumps irrigated vast fields. Electric conveyor moved grain into storage facilities, and electric lighting allowed farm work to continue regardless of seasonal daylight variations. The productivity gains were staggering. Individual American farms produced more food than entire German agricultural districts, and they did so while sending their young men off to fight in Europe and the Pacific. Even more sobering was the discovery that this abundance wasn't limited to essential industries. American civilians continued to enjoy electric entertainment even as their nation fought a global war. Prisoners granted weekend passes to attend church services or cultural events found themselves in communities where movie theatres operated every night under bright electric mares, where dance halls stayed open until midnight with electric bands and air conditioning, and where residential neighbourhoods glowed with porch lights and window illumination that suggested a population untouched by the privations of war. Lieutenant Weber, the former tank commander, found himself questioning everything he had believed about American society during a work assignment at a railroad switching yard in Missouri. The yard operated under floodlights so bright that midnight looked like noon, allowing train operations to continue around the clock with no reduction in efficiency. Freight trains loaded with war materials departed every few, their destinations marked on shipping labels that revealed the staggering scale of American production. Tanks bound for Britain, aircraft engines heading to Soviet artillery shells destined, all moving through a transportation that never slept and never dimmed its. But what truly shattered Weber's preconceptions was a conversation with his American supervisor, a railroad foreman named Mike O'Brien, whose son was fighting in Italy. O'Brien explained that the switching yard's electrical consumption had actually increased since the war began, not decreased. Military shipments required additional lighting for security and efficiency, while civilian freight continued at pre-war levels to maintain home-front morale and economic stability. The idea that a nation could simultaneously increase both military and civilian electrical consumption while fighting a global war violated everything Weber thought he knew about resource management and national priorities. The cultural shock extended beyond mere infrastructure into fundamental questions about society and government. German prisoners discovered that American electrical abundance wasn't the result of authoritarian planning or state control over resources. Instead, it emerged from a competitive system where private companies built power plants and transmission lines to meet consumer demand. The Tennessee Valley Authority represented government involvement in electrical development, but even TVA operated alongside private utilities in a mixed system that seemed to generate abundance through competition rather than central planning. This revelation proved particularly disturbing to prisoners who had been raised under National Socialist ideology. They had been taught that only strong centralized control could mobilize national resources effectively, and that democratic societies were inherently inefficient and weak. Yet here they found themselves in a nation where private companies competing for profit had created electrical infrastructure that dwarfed anything achieved by centralized German planning. The cognitive dissonance was profound and deeply unsettling. As 1943 turned into 1944 and German military fortunes continued to decline, the psychological impact of American abundance on prisoner morale became increasingly evident. Letters home, when they were permitted, carried descriptions that shocked recipients in rationed, bomb-damaged German cities. Families struggling with blackout regulations and severely limited electricity received accounts of prisoner camps where lights burned freely, and American guards seemed puzzled by German amazement at such basic amenities. The contrast became even more stark as news from Germany painted an increasingly desperate picture. Cities faced rolling blackouts to conserve fuel for power plants. Factories operated on reduced schedules to manage limited electrical capacity. Civilians learned to live with candles and oil lamps as electrical power was reserved for essential war production. Meanwhile, German prisoners in America observed a society where civilian electrical consumption continued to grow even as military demands increased exponentially. Some prisoners attempted to rationalize what they were seeing. Perhaps this abundance was temporary, they reasoned. A final burst of consumption before American resources collapsed under the strain of global warfare. Perhaps the electrical infrastructure they witnessed was concentrated in special areas designed to impress prisoners. While the majority of America struggled with shortages similar to those in Germany, these hopes proved increasingly difficult to maintain as prisoners were transferred between camps and work assignments across the country, encountering the same abundance in every location. The turning point for many came when they began interacting directly with American civilians who worked alongside them in various labor assignments. These Americans, farmers, factory workers, shopkeepers, and railroad employees displayed no sense of living under wartime restrictions or making significant sacrifices for the war effort. Their homes remained fully lit. Their businesses operated normal hours, and their conversations revealed a population that viewed wartime prosperity as normal and expected rather than remarkable or temporary. Sarah Martinez worked as a clerk in the supply office at Camp Swift in Texas, where she processed requisitions for prisoner needs and coordinated with local businesses to provide goods and services. To German prisoners like Corporal Hans Zimmermann, who had been captured in Tunisia, Sarah represented something almost impossible to comprehend. A civilian whose wartime lifestyle exceeded what most Germans had enjoyed during peacetime prosperity. She drove her own automobile to work each day, lived in an electrically lit apartment with modern appliances, and earned wages that allowed her to purchase consumer goods that had disappeared from German stores years earlier. What struck Zimmermann most profoundly was Sarah's attitude toward the war itself. She understood that her brother was fighting in the Pacific and that rationing affected certain goods like gasoline and rubber, but she displayed no sense of existential national struggle or desperate resource conservation. To her, the war was something America was fighting overseas while maintaining normal life at home, a perspective that challenged everything Zimmermann had been taught about the relationship between warfare and civilian society. The final psychological blow came when prisoners began to understand the true scale of American electrical production. Through conversations with guards, work supervisors, and civilian employees, they learned that the abundance they witnessed represented only a fraction of American capacity. Power plants under construction would double electrical generation within 2 years. Hydroelectric projects in development would harness river systems across entire regions. Nuclear research, though still classified, hinted at energy sources that could make current abundance seem modest by comparison. By early 1944, even the most dedicated Nazi believers among the German prisoner population found their faith in ultimate German victory severely shaken. The evidence of American abundance was too overwhelming, too consistent, and too obviously genuine to dismiss as propaganda or deception. These men had seen firsthand that their opponent possessed not just superior resources, but a completely different relationship between resources and society, one that generated abundance rather than managing scarcity. The psychological transformation manifested in various ways throughout the prisoner camps. Some men became deeply depressed, recognizing that they had been fighting an unwinnable war against an opponent whose strength they had never understood. Others threw themselves into learning English and American customs, already anticipating a post-war world where German influence would be negligible and American power would dominate global affairs. Still others became intensely curious about how American society actually functioned, engaging guards and civilian workers in lengthy conversations about democracy, capitalism, and the relationship between individual freedom and collective prosperity. Perhaps most significantly, many prisoners began to question not just military strategy, but the fundamental assumptions about society and government that had shaped their lives. If democratic capitalism could generate such abundance while fighting a global war, what did that suggest about authoritarian socialism's claims to efficiency and strength? If competitive free markets could create electrical infrastructure superior to central planning, what other aspects of National Socialist ideology might be fundamentally flawed? The ripple effects extended far beyond individual psychological transformations. As word spread through the prisoner network, camps across America began reporting similar patterns of ideological doubt and political questioning. German officers found their authority undermined by enlisted men who had seen too much American abundance to believe in German superiority. Political discussions in camp barracks shifted from confident predictions of eventual victory to bewildered attempts to understand how Germany had so completely misjudged its opponent's capabilities. The war continued for another year after these revelations began spreading through the prisoner population. But for many German prisoners, the psychological conflict had already ended. They had seen the future, and it was brightly lit with American electric power. The abundance that had first caught their attention from train windows had evolved into a comprehensive understanding of their opponent's true strength, not just military or industrial capacity, but a social and economic system capable of generating prosperity that seemed to violate the basic rules of wartime resource management. When news of Germany's surrender finally reached prisoner camps in May 1945, many of the men who had witnessed America's electrical abundance responded with relief rather than grief. They had already understood that the war was unwinnable, not because of battlefield defeats or tactical errors, but because Germany had chosen to fight an opponent whose civilian economy alone possessed greater capacity than the entire German war machine. The lights that first astonished them from the train did more than brighten American cities. They exposed the core of American power, a vast, effortless abundance that reshaped their very notion of strength. In the end, the German prisoners who witnessed this electrical plenty confronted something more unsettling than mere military superiority, an entirely different blueprint for how a society could organize itself to create prosperity and power. The lights burning in American cities weren't just evidence of superior infrastructure. They were proof of a system that created wealth and abundance as natural byproducts of freedom and competition.